Hey Freya, forgive me for any butchering of the English language, it's not my first language. And starting with your GIF and why you were confused, rightfully so if I might add, because Blender is so frustrating when you're just starting. In summary, it's not the gizmo nor is it is the cursor that will snap to the grid, but rather it is the pivot of the object. We have to always be very mindful of the difference between the 3D cursor, our gizmo, and the pivot, or as they call here in Blender, the origin of the object. So if I get this and I activate the snapping, you see that while it might seem that my gizmo is moving randomly, the pivot point is indeed snapping to the grid. So a few things to keep in mind that will be very useful. First is that you can activate the snapping with Shift Tab. It's the cursor to toggle on or off. And if you go to the drop down menu or you press Ctrl Shift Tab to open it, you can activate or deactivate this absolute grid snap. If the absolute grid snap is deactivated, it will move into grid increments but not really snap to it, you know. And another thing is that you, depending on the state that you started moving your object, if the snap is turned on or off, if you hold Ctrl, it will do the opposite. Like I had here my snap turned off. If I hold Ctrl, it will turn on temporarily. And the last thing, but I lost count of how many fucking times this happened to me, which is that when you start zooming in, you can see that the grid starts to subdivide, right? If I snap to right now, it will snap to those subdivisions. Wait, let me move it a bit closer. Seriously, I don't know how many times I was swearing at Blender because I was at this zoom, which starts appearing those subdivisions, but it's really hard to notice, and I would be like, "You're a motherfucker, why are you not snapping?" And oh, it's the zoom. Okay. So now I'm going to go into your questions. First of all, it's very useful to understand how to manipulate the cursor, the 3D cursor. I've come from 3D Max, so I was used to manipulate the pivot point and the gizmo, and they were kind of the same thing. Same goes for ZBrush. So, but here we don't really have those kind of options. The cursor is our helper, and we should get used to it. And it's very useful, actually. I didn't really like it at first, but nowadays I find it even more practical than what I did in 3D Max. So I believe you already know this from what I saw in your GIF, but Shift and right click, you will reposition it. You can activate here snapped, so you can snap the reposition to the grid. But even more important than that, to me, is the menu Shift S. This will open this radio menu here, and you can take a look later at what each of those options do, but the most important for me is cursor to selected. So you see that my cursor now is was positioned in the center of this cube, and we can use this to our advantage, because for instance, you mentioned something like, well, I want this face here to be aligned to the grid. Okay, I can go into edit mode, Shift S. Oops, wait. I select the face I want, and it is a face, although it's in orthographic view. Shift S, cursor to selected, and now I go out of edit mode, drop down object menu, and set origin to 3D cursor. Now, if I try to move it and I set it to snap, zoom, you see that it's snapping where I want. Although something else to be careful is that it can be quite confusing using the gizmo position to be into the cursor or the transformation point, whatever you want to call it. You had this, right? And if you use it anything else, at least in this situation that we just have one object selected, the gizmo and the pivot would be aligned and it would make much more sense about what was happening with the snap tool. So anyways, and we have other useful options, which is for instance the active element, which I will explore right now, because perhaps you do not want to move your entire object, which is actually what I understood from your question. You want to just move those top faces, right? So I can come here, I can select those top faces. Let me do this real quick. Oh, I kind of messed up this thing here. Huh. Whatever. So I'm gonna select these faces here, and I'm going to, what the hell? Okay. And I want to this face here to be my reference. You have to use the active element for this. The active element is anything that is marked in white and should be the last thing you selected. But it needs to be with clicking. If I try to select this with lasso tool, for instance, you'll see that it will remember the last thing I clicked, which was this face, even if I unselect it. And it will keep it as the active element. So shift clicking what I want to be the active element. Let me choose the other faces here. And now I can move it and use this to snap. Shift tab, G. And this is very useful because, for instance, I fucked up in here my topology, right? How could I align this so it's not, well, how could I unfuck this? I could select the points I want to align, and I could press S to scale, Z, so I lock it to the Z axis, and 0, so they align to the same height. If I did not have the active element selected for my transformation point, what would happen is that it would either go to my cursor or to the center point or whatever. But if I have chosen the active, it will always always going to the wrong drop down menu. It will always go back to the active element. So I can make again S, Z to lock, and 0. I could also make this for the other faces and not just the points. And so come on here, SZ0. And now I have an unaligned object. So those are a few ways you can mess with the transformations here in Blender. I hope this at least will shed you some light on what you can search for when you have further trouble, probably, because this is confusing and it's easy to forget. But I hope it's helpful. So, yay, here it is.